Welcome to the Michael Brooks Show. We're broadcasting live from various different types of quarantines. I'm Michael Brooks with super producer Matt Leck.
Hello.
Chief theoretician of economic analysis, David Griscom.
How's it going?
I like that. That's a very kind of 1970s sort of
Yeah,
style.
that's a long way to do it.
Yeah. I'm the chief of future planning and scenario strategy. And let's do like early 2000s. Matt is chief innovation and blue sky officer. We sound like consulting firms from different eras. That's what I like. On this week's program, Robert McChesney. He's a very, very well-known and great scholar. He teaches at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. He's been an advisor to Bernie Sanders. He's the author of numerous books on media monopolies and democracy. We're talking about how the internet went from an attempt, even as it was military funded, at an open and democratic forum to mass surveillance, corporate oligarchy, and why it threatens every single aspect of our democratic, private, and open lives. And also his thoughts on the uprisings and our moment now. Plus, of course, we're talking about in the post game, Joe Biden. His campaign strategy is working. And it might be primarily because Donald Trump is completely failing and it's pathetic, which we'll be talking about too, both with the great Artesia Balthrop. But Joe Biden is making some strategic decisions where his campaign is that makes sense. And we need to analyze them and look at them objectively and see their enormous and obvious limitations should he enter the White House, but also why they're working and what they're getting right, and why, of course, we need to get Donald Trump out the door. Tucker Carlson, he's flip-flopping on masks, and it's part of a broader breakdown as he tries to steer the ship of the Trump reelect in the Fox News Republican propaganda division. Brian Meir on how lawfare works, not just making Lula a political prisoner, but with ramifications everywhere across Latin America, across the left in Latin America, and even targeting of Morales post-coup. The historical roots of prison abolition, Angela Davis's reinvention of carceral logic, and a whole lot more in the post-game. Of course, in the main show, we're going to also be, of course, having a gem with future planning, economic analyst, planner. David, what do we got?
Hey, I'm just giving everyone a little bit of advice that if you want to see where the capitalist class is thinking, it's time to start watching the banks and stop watching the stock market.
Love it. But first, let's talk about ending hunger. You know, I was inspired last week, and if you haven't watched yet, please watch the conversation with the great Vijay Prashad, where he spoke about the context of defund the police, the racist history of America, the class context, and the very simple notion that we use policing, in his terminology, to get in between people and food, the basic necessities of life. And I want to bring back this very, very simple and core concept. We should have a global campaign in the United States and every corner of the world to completely get rid of every single form of hunger. Let's do that. Let's have that very, very clear, very, very basic and human and universal goal for every single human on this planet. It's absolutely ridiculous. And I could tell you as someone, and again, I'll be very, very clear here, infinitely more sort of safe and privileged than most. But my family did experience at times some forms of food insecurity. And even those most mild things where it was never really, really going to be an issue, maybe a missed meal here, a missed meal there, the anxiety, the pain of that, the depth of that is something that absolutely no one should experience. And of course, Many, many human beings do. In fact, the numbers have been increasing. There's an estimated 775 million undernourished people in 2014. By 2008, that estimate had increased to 820 million. Hunger is on the rise. The UN estimates that the COVID crisis will lead to an additional 83 to 132 million undernourished people. UN agencies have also made the argument that the international poverty threshold of $1.90 a day is not enough to afford a healthy diet. 3 million people cannot afford healthy diet, according to the UN. This is very important, actually, that figure. That's the figure that the World Bank and others with a kind of Panglossian view have deployed to downplay the significance, the resilience, then the absolute massive burden of the amount of deeply impoverished and hungry people across this planet. And of course, this problem is not in any way exclusive to the underdeveloped world. Let's look at the United States, a world leader in inequality and poverty, even as it is the world's main superpower. The money goes to the weapons and out of the mouths of the poor. 37 million people struggle with hunger. 11 million of those are children. It's estimated that 40.4 million Americans are on SNAP. And of course, the Trump administration and its Republican allies have been waging a vicious, no other word could be used other than evil war to try to cut food stamps and SNAP benefits from the beginning of this administration. And that, of course, has not changed during the COVID pandemic depression that the Trump administration facilitated through its grotesque incompetence, along with 6.9 million women and children assisted by the WIC program. But even those with access to these programs, many communities in the United States struggle to stock healthy and affordable food. We know the systems of food deserts and the general undernourishment of all poor populations and many working populations across this country. In last year, Donald Trump proposed a cut to SNAP that would cut nearly 700,000 people off of the program. Court challenges in the COVID crisis have stopped the proposal from going into effect. But as I said before, the Trump 2021 budget suggests more cuts to the program, including cutting the budget of SNAP by over $180 billion. That's nearly 30% of the budget over the coming decade. Now, there's also a cash crop disaster. We produce enough food to provide everyone with a healthy diet, but our economic system will always, of course, prioritize profit over people. Globalization has drastically affected the food market, most consequentially something called cash cropping. African farmers have been encouraged to grow coffee, sugar, cocoa beans, tea, and cotton, and to use the money they've earned to buy food, and all in the process of driving down systems of resiliency, sustainability, and self-sufficiency. This has led to the underproduction of traditional staples and higher prices for those, even as pushes for things like value-added taxes in countries like Kenya, the most regressive and poor and working targeted form of taxation. Let's watch this clip of former Brazilian president, who, of course, we greatly admire and advocated for when he was a political prisoner on the show, Lula da Silva, speaking to Oxfam on the core need of getting rid of hunger several years ago.
Cabe a cada Estado a responsabilidade da segurança alimentar do seu povo, garantindo a produção de alimentos ou a renda para que cada família possa adquirir o que comer. Essa é a condição básica para a paz, a democracia e a cidadania. Não existe conquista mais importante para uma sociedade do que poder tomar café de manhã, almoçar e jantar. Portanto, essa luta é de todos. Primeiro, de cada governo, que tem que assumir as suas responsabilidades. Depois, dos países mais ricos, que tem que ajudar no desenvolvimento dos países mais pobres. E de toda a sociedade, colocando em prática a solidariedade a de que todo ser humano é capaz. Por isso, eu apoio a campanha Cresça, da Oxfam.
And that beautiful sentiment right there is it. There is no democracy. There is no functioning citizenship. There is no basic humanity while there is hunger. Let's look at how Lula achieved, and he did, of course, until the coup of Dilma Rousseff and the reversals. But he took, when he was president, Brazil out of hunger through the Zero Hunger Program. It was launched in 2003. It was massively successful in its operation in around 40% of Brazilian communities. Childhood growth stunting was cut in half from 1996 to 2007. It was a comprehensive program. It included helping farmers with modernization, providing credits and subsidies, encouraging them to diversify their crops. It set up programs to allow local organizations like food banks, hospitals, restaurants, and schools to support and purchase food from these farmers at subsidized rates. This is so crucial. It also included investments in roads and infrastructure, and it supported basic forms of cash transfer along with access to schooling. Hunger must be understood as a human-made problem. Direct aid is needed, but also a shift towards a system that changes how and for who we produce food. Lula's poverty and hunger programs took a wide view, understanding you can't address hunger without addressing poverty and how the market fails to prioritize the needs of the poor. This problem is still with us. It's relentless. It's relentless in the United States. It's relentless in the developing world. And of course, it increases everywhere, east, west, north, south, in the main, with the conditions of global pandemic and economic depression. But this is a choice. This is a choice that can be addressed through humane, compassionate, human-centered global policy. Let's do it. Let's demand a zero hunger pledge and a policy in action on all forms of basic poverty in the United States and internationally. And let's reject all those World Bank metrics that would de-emphasize the full magnitude of the problem, even as the actual material conditions stopping us from addressing these problems are very small.
I think it's important to really shout out the approach that Lula's initiative took, because the cash crop issue is something that is a major problem. And the problem is so much more than just like, oh, we're growing the wrong crop. It destroys distribution networks. And that was one thing that was so great about the Lula system, is it's like, yes, there has to be modernization. There has to be different kinds of ships on these like smaller farms. But there also needs to be a creation of pipelines, of roadways to get the food from the farms to communities. But because of modern globalized capitalism, for decades, you have all these farming communities, and the primary goal was to export abroad. So when they, so even if they were to shift the kind of what they were growing, that doesn't have a clear way to get to communities that are in need of it. And just starting to think really, because a lot of people really still don't understand this, like we do have the productive capacity to make sure that we don't have to have hunger. It is a choice. And it's a choice that is not always made by individuals, but it's a sum total of a system that very much puts, the needs of the highest bidder above everyone else. That's what a market system does. So if you can make more money selling coffee to Americans than you can from selling fruits or vegetables to people within your own nation, that's what you want to do, right? And you have to have a kind of system like Lula created and other people have tried to implement that mitigates that counteracts that by using subsidies, by using all these other things. Because without it, we will live in this completely upside down world where we actually have more productive capacity than ever before. But hunger is being reintroduced to communities that haven't experienced hunger in a very long time.
Yeah, I mean, I just can't help but think how horrifying it is that we haven't done this already. And you look at like 100 years ago, utopian types of literature. The idea that people would still be so hungry, I mean, it's a major failing of humanity.
Absolutely. And I think there's also a number of other things that we need to look at, and we need to definitely support community-supported agriculture everywhere. That's actually a really, really effective and positive model. We're going to talk more about the landless workers movement in Brazil. There's some very interesting organizations in the United States connecting concepts around reparations with land, basically with food production. and distribution. And this can also be connected, more broadly with things like, Madragon or Cooperation Jackson, the other side of the central importance of labor organizing, but with people engaging in various kind of cooperative forms of work. I do want to say, I don't want to, open up this whole debate, but this is the other core reason that the whole argument about genetically modified foods, the only thing that was relevant from a public policy perspective was the monopoly power that it gave these enormously dangerous corporations like Monsanto in terms of, literal intellectual property ownership of crops and of seeds. And those are things that need to be completely decommodified and in a commons. And in fact, it's a commons that already exists. A lot of things that we can see in agriculture and biogenetics, and of course, really viciously, we just saw this in Brazil, a move towards privatizing water, or the viciousness of privatization of water in Flint, is this connection between what Marx would say would be primitive accumulation and the basic building blocks of life. And that's core to all of these questions. And it's inseparable ultimately from getting rid of hunger and from protecting global commons, food, seeds, water, air. They have to be for all of us. And they have to be governed democratically.
And I'd just add, I think if capitalism had any intention of solving this problem on its own, it would have solved it in the richest country in the history of the earth. And it shows no intention of doing that.
Absolutely. All right, folks, let me just say, actually, you know what? While we're doing the Patreon pitch, we didn't plan on this, but can we pull up one of the illicit histories from the illicit history playlist? I should say, if you're a $21 or above patron, that's a huge thing. It really supports us because we're definitely, we're losing people because of the conditions we're in. So this is definitely a time at either an $8 patron where you get every single episode, 3 episodes a week, essentially, and you support this very long main show. 21 and above and any other above patron deeply support us in what we're doing, including making these video illicit histories, which always go out to patrons first and then are released for everybody. And you can watch all of them on the playlist on our YouTube channel. And it supports other things. David and I are in the process of assembling a book, a TMBS guide that deals with core concepts, including anti-essentialism, following the work of Adolf Reed Jr., internationalism. What would a genuinely open, compassionate, regenerative culture and society actually look like, with deep implications, of course, for dealing with all of the, not only the toxicities on the left, but the toxicities of the culture at large. And also why post-ideology is most usually BS. We're going to be self-publishing that. That's something, that we're working on. And even the closed stuff, which is fun. And I'm going to start talking more about some of the people that are working on that, including somebody that's very important to me. But, it helps us. So that's huge if you're able to do it. But we need everything right now. If you're in a position, definitely become a patron. Let's say the first couple of minutes of this Patrice Lumumba one, just because it was Patrice Lumumba's birthday recently. These are so amazing that you support these. This is, of course, featuring the just unparalleled situation, Milton Alamati. Let's watch a minute of this and go to patreon.com/TMBS. While you're watching this, hit like, throw a super chat donation if you want. That helps. But the main vehicle is go to patreon.com/TMBS. Let's take in a few minutes of this illicit history and go support us.
I think that the white people should be ashamed of the deplorable situation that has been existing in the Congo, which is not the fault of the Congolese, but which is the result of instigation by European powers who are fighting each other over the mineral wealth of the Congo. And now to make it appear that the Congolese themselves are criminals or brutes because they're reacting to these injustices that they've been victimized by is again ducking the question.
Shambi is the murderer of Lumumba, who was the rightful prime minister of the Congo. Shambi is the man whose forces fought against the United Nations forces and against the United States, and despite this criminal past of Shambi. Now the United States is backing Shambi, who has hired South African mercenaries who are hired killers to disrupt the peaceful efforts of the freedom fighters from Stanleyville to make the type of country there that they want.
Patrice Lumumba was the first democratically elected prime minister of the Congo. He came up at the time of African nationalism and Pan-Africanism. Nationalism and the push for liberation really took hold in the 1950s. After World War II, demobilized African veterans of the war who had been drafted and taken to Europe to fight on behalf of empire in wars that they had no role in, came back and started demanding independence.
So, guys, I'm just really proud of these. And of course, the audio illicit histories come out every Sunday. Sometimes they're deep dives. Watch the conversation we unlocked with the great Joanna Wiest on full queer equity, capital power, and the Supreme Court. Brianna Last on what an actual working class DSA would look like, but also much broader, much more in terms of historical focus. We put those out every Sunday. This Sunday, I'm going to be talking with a teacher of mine, Susan Green. It's going to be on a kind of different sort of focus as we sort of incorporate more topics and more reach into this show as well. We appreciate it and all of you. Patreon.com/TMBS. Do you guys have anything else you want to add?
I mean, the only other thing I pitch too is every 2 weeks I do a little theory reading group. And
yes, sir.
This week, sometimes I do a lot of pieces. Sometimes I do like one longer one. So like this week, I think it's really important to revisit the work of Ralph Miliband if you're not familiar with him. So I took a little jump into that. And that's just a nice space to be able to kind of, pick up new topics or writers or thinkers that you might have not been exposed to before. And also go over a lot of like the kind of basic history and text and socialist philosophy, Marxist communist philosophy.
I mean, hey, all school is going to be like this. It looks like if Devos has anything to say about it. So, David, meet new teacher, Mr. Griscom.
That's right.
Set your kids in front of him.
Get some homework from David. And let me just say too that, of course, Matt finished Against the Web this past week. And
I did. It was excellent. It sent me. I was in a bit of a Brett Weinstein phase, and so I wanted some IDW material. But it's very good, Michael. I had read the first. I had read the first chapter, the Sam Harris stuff, but I hadn't got through Peterson and Shapiro. But I mean, honestly, for anybody who's even toying with the new iterations of that, one thing I did notice is I feel like Quillette has fallen off.
Yeah,
but that's the one proper noun I feel like that has lost currency since you wrote it. But besides that, or despite that, I think it's going to stay current because of and how I appreciate that size of a book. I think, especially if especially for the audience and for what the project is of it. I think it's very well done. So
I'm really honored by that, and I will say, the concluding chapter on the cosmopolitan socialism, I truly believe, has a lot of answers. The enormous toxicity and delusions of woke, but also not just having a reaction to it, but really something hopefully dialectical and hopefully with some transcendence into something new and better. That's certainly the future of, a big part of my focus. And I'd
say that response, I think, has aged well.
Awesome. Well, I'm super legit, really happy to hear that. So I'd recommend, guys, if you haven't yet, go to Red Emma's worker-owned cooperative in Baltimore, buy yourself a copy of Against the Web, Cosmopolitan Answer to New Right. And we will be having some TMBS guides for you this fall as well, which are going to be self-publishing. So that's another adventure. Excited about that, David?
Oh, yeah.
All right, guys. I guess is Professor McChesney here?
Yep, I'll admit him now. Should be joining us any second here. There's his mic. And let's see if we can get his video.
All right.
Hi, Bob.
Hey.
Hi.
Hey, Professor McChesney, actually, or Bob, as I should say, meet Matt Leck and David Griscom.
Oh, do I have to turn my video on?
Yep,
Yes,
still need your video. There we go.
Okay, great. You're here. Say hi to David and Matt. We'll get going. Professor Robert McChesney teaches at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. He is the author of numerous books. I'm quite sure that you're familiar with him. He focuses on everything from money and politics, media monopoly, history, the left. I remember a book I read, I don't even remember when at this point, Rich Media, Poor Democracy, Communication, Politics, and Dubious Times, which came out in 2000. He's obviously several more recent books, and is been an advisor to Bernie Sanders and an activist in many different areas. Bob, thanks so much for being here. Really appreciate you taking the time.
Hey, it's my pleasure, Michael.
So I want to just start, just because obviously you're somebody who, has been at this and has seen a lot and knows a lot. We're in this moment of basically pandemic, depression, facilitated very specifically by the Trump administration, has to be said. This enormous uprising sparked by the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and a different conversation around policing. And then, an election too. So what's your big picture read of where we're at now, the trends you see, where they're going?
Well, I guess the best way to make sense of what is a highly flammable situation is to do it in layers. Before COVID, before George Floyd, what were we looking at then? And we were looking at, a Trump administration, which is obviously sort of reduced to the absurd capitalist governance. I mean, entirely corrupt, entirely unprincipled, entirely disinterested in actually governing in any meaningful sense of the term, even by capitalist standards. Sort of the bottom has come out of the cup with this guy. And I think what Trump did before all the stuff hit the fan, what Trump did is he exposed how bankrupt the Republican Party had become. Because if you remember, until Trump got the nomination, for the previous 20 years, the Republican Party would win off-year elections and occasionally presidential elections. And they would always say, well, our voters want a balanced budget and they want deregulation and they want to get rid of social programs. And that's what we're representing their interests. They want corporations to run America. But then Trump showed us that's all a lot of baloney. The base that the Republicans depended on were a bunch of bigots and racists, and that's what motivated them, hate. And he sort of showed all that stuff that John McCain and Mitt Romney said. Voters didn't care about that. They didn't care about any of that sort of stuff. They wanted to hate. So he sort of started the job of blowing up the Republican Party, and it probably will be finished this November. And it's pretty much shattered. And in a way, that leaves the Democratic Party in an interesting position because Bernie Sanders had done a pretty good job of exposing how it had been deeply flawed and failed really to rise to the issues of our times either. And, Sanders got run out of the race early, and how that happened is a whole show in itself and need not occupy us. But in a way, the Democrats are getting a pass now in the short term. Biden just has to shut up and get out of the way to get elected. And that's true for most Democrats. The Republicans are imploding. But when they assume power, and let's assume they can get control of the Senate to make this work, the Democratic Party in Washington, their instincts and their money lenders, their donors, are all going to be to revert to the Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama playbook. Same Pentagon budget, same bogus energy, environmental policies, same foreign policy, same cuddling up with Wall Street. And that won't work. That we know now will be not just sort of something you sweep under the rug for the next administration. That will be an abject failure immediately. And that's where we're at a very interesting time, because I think the last time the United States government was in this severe situation was probably in 1933. 32 to 33. And the Great Depression was at rock bottom. And every traditional way to address that failed, was not working. And it was a 25% unemployment. So I think we start there. Then you put in the COVID-19, which exposed, needless to say, all the fault lines in our society have been magnified. Everything we said just became much worse. And now we're sort of this laughing stock of the world as we have this inane federal non-policy, which is basically comfortable just writing off hundreds of thousands of lives, apparently. And while the rest of the world basically had sane policies. And you can go most places in Europe, they're going to be playing soccer in the fall. They're already playing it. Schools will be fully convened. People will be out in bars. And in this country, we won't have football. Can't send our kids to school. People are going to be locked up in their houses probably until the vaccine comes. And people are going to look around and say, this is absurd. And so that just guarantees Trump's off. He can't win unless there's severe voter suppression, far greater than we've ever had before in this country. It would have to be, it would be extraordinary. So, and then finally, two issues. One we talk about a lot correctly, and one that doesn't get anywhere near enough attention. You have the uprising after the George Floyd murder, and that was something that was extraordinary. There's, that in itself would define a decade or maybe a generation in itself. And the demonstrations, the protests that are going on since then have been like nothing else I've ever seen in this country. And I remember the 60s in Cleveland, Ohio, and police brutality triggering some of the most extraordinary riots in every major American city, certainly Cleveland twice in those summers. And there was nothing like this, though. There weren't white people protesting with African Americans against police violence and taking it really seriously. That shocked me. And it was the best thing I'd ever seen. This is so awesome. And it also showed, I think, for me as a white leftist, how we really miscalculated the situation. I've talked to my friends, African-American friends who are on the left, and they'd be on Bernie's case. They say Bernie should be really talking about racial justice more, and not in sort of this Joy Reid, people should get a job on the General Motors board because they're black and then went to Yale, but rather in the streets, the racism that black people face day to day from the cops, from landlords, from employers. This has got to really be in his bone marrow of his speech. And Bernie gave a great speech, and it wasn't in his bone marrow. It wasn't quite that level. And now I can see that was one of the flaws of his campaign, but it's something that's not going away. To cut to a short answer, it's going to be a defining thing that politicians are going to have to deal with, and the streets will fill up again. We're past the point of no return on that. And then last but not least, probably the biggest issue of all. We talked about the last time we were in this situation, it was the Great Depression. Well, guess what? Our economy is going to be a shambles now, and nothing being done by the federal government suggests it won't be a shambles for the rest of this year going into next year. There's not going to be a trampoline down there that shoots us back up to 3% unemployment or 4% unemployment. To the contrary, it's going to be a very difficult recovery. It's going to require extensive and aggressive government funding, programs, bankrolling, far beyond anything this government's been willing to do. And not just the usual stuff, which is like Trump is an expert at, paying off hedge funds and corporations and let them flood the stock market with their money to raise their stock prices, but real money going in to create jobs for working class people. Because this is going to be those desperate times for the American working class in a century. And that will be very soon. I think after the dust clears on these other stories, that will be the central story of the coming moment.
Yeah. And so I want to loop back to one aspect about the Trump base. But first, let me just keep following on that. If we look at Biden, and interestingly enough, and it's rhetorical, and we know Biden's record, whatever. But setting that aside, I mean, he's actually embracing an interesting trajectory, at least rhetorically, in the policy he's putting out. And I should say, I see a lot of Stan Greenberg in it. And Stan Greenberg's an interesting pollster and strategist because he's absolutely, one of the creators of the modern Democratic Party, arguably. But he was of that sort of much more fixated on kind of moving to the center right on certain so-called social issues, and especially for a DC pollster, has, he's very unafraid to criticize certain things like inequality in corporations. He actually wrote a decent piece in 2016, kind of taking Hillary to task on some of this stuff. And it's not, it's still not a structural thing. So, I mean, he's not talking about single payer, but he is talking about kind of like the first Clinton campaign. You raise taxes on rich people, you do something to spur union growth, you have a real public option. And I guess the two-part question that I have for you is, number one, it's interesting to me as somebody who's, I'm very willing to kind of criticize and all of the stuff that I don't like personally, and I don't think is broadly popular, which is, kind of the woke stuff. But I also think a lot of us on the left have gotten way too complacent about, assuming like, yes, there's a certain popularity for Medicare for all. But I think the way Biden is putting it together in this very kind of gradualist way is frankly comforting for a lot of people. I think we need to contend with that. And the second part of the question I have for you is, I guess, is the toolbox question. There's the like, we should get to Medicare for all, of course, as like a normative answer. But are we at a point where, in the 80s and 90s, these kind of third way models, the left would reject because it didn't solve the problems and it didn't really go to the root, but it worked in some ways for that time. Now, is it going to work? I mean, is there enough capacity in the system to kind of have that sort of gradualist approach meet the moment in any way?
No, I don't think it will work. And I think that's the lesson of the Sanders movement and the Trump movement I started with. The mainstream approach, which is third way, the sort of neoliberal, in the case of the Republicans, neoliberal, in the case of the Democrats, neoliberalism of the human face. But those sort of approaches have failed. That's why we ended up in 2016 with all the mainstream candidates who embodied those approaches, the Jeb Bushes, the Hillary Clintons, just really not working for their voters and their party. And the most important part of that is young voters, which is something that if Bernie Sanders got very little support from young voters like Hillary Clinton did, it would have been the biggest story of 2016. It would have been the biggest story of 2020. What they still can't wrap their heads around was that Sanders dominated among young people, and not 22 and under, not 30 and under, 40 and under, 45 and under. And every year his domination gets 1 year older. They weren't changing their positions as they got a few years older. And I think we have a whole generation now that more than any generation ever in American history is ripe for really serious structural change in this country, is open to it and understand it's necessary, that what we've done so far isn't working. Because behind all the 4% unemployment and all the jobs, life for most Americans is much worse today than it was a generation ago. Salaries suck, job conditions are horrible, insecurity is rampant. The quality of life of human happiness is just hard. It's a hard world to live in. And people who are living it understand that. And, really old rich people maybe haven't gotten the memo, but they haven't looked at the life of their kids or their grandkids enough to see what's going on. Young people get it. So that's the fundamental change. That didn't exist in the 80s or 90s. So when Bill Clinton came into power, when the Republicans were in power, that era, it was understandable why you would do neoliberalism of the human face. You knew there was a small electorate. You wanted to chip away some people in the middle to win just enough states to get power. But you also would never do anything to antagonize your major funders on Wall Street, real estate developers, corporate America. But you would, you'd be with a human face. And that's what's failed. That doesn't work anymore. That's the lesson Hillary didn't learn in 2016. If she'd put Sherrod Brown or Elizabeth Warren on the ticket, she would have won easily in 2016. Instead, she said, basically lifted her middle finger to like 40% of her party and said, "Screw you! You come vote for me and my guy. Well, you don't mean nothing to me." And she lost. And Joe Biden would lose if he did the same thing. Except this time, Trump's so hated, maybe even that approach would win now. But Biden, I think, hopefully, is smart enough to understand that that he and Greenberg will tip off. The polling not only shows this, but this actual concrete situation we face is that those traditional things of the Bill Clinton approach won't work. And I'd say this goes back not just a few years. I mean, there's been a lot of work done recently on Barack Obama when he got elected. And it was quickly glossed over what an extraordinary election that was in 2008, what it really represented and what we lost then because Obama wasn't up to the moment. And what I mean by that is in 2006, the Democrats won a landslide against George W. Bush, an off-year election, a Democratic landslide, highly unusual. Then they followed it up in 2008 with another landslide election that put Obama in the White House. The last time one party had two consecutive landslide elections like that in the United States was under FDR in the 1930s when he put in the New Deal. So basically, Obama walked into office in 2009 with a mandate for really sweeping change, and he produced almost nothing. He basically lifted the Republicans off the mat, patted them on the butt, said, come on, get back in the game, guys. You know, we're all friends here. We went to Harvard together. You know, we're all on the same team. And he got very little done. And then the voter turnout plummeted in 2010, and he lost the House and the Senate, plummeted in 2014, same way. And he didn't really get much done. Those voters who were alienated from Obama became Sanders base. They became the people who said, yeah, we really want this social change stuff. So my hope is with Biden, assuming he gets into office and he has both the control of the House and Senate, which I believe he will, that Biden will be like FDR was. When FDR came into power in 1933, he was a mainstream Democrat. He was not a progressive. He was not on the left wing of the party. He was purely out of the mainstream. And he tried a bunch of mainstream stuff for a year or so, and it didn't work. And he said, okay, this isn't getting me anywhere. I'm not solving the problems. And he created the New Deal, and really the great progressive programs we associate with him came after he failed that first round. Well, Joe Biden doesn't have the luxury of failing for a year or two. He's got to come in and get right at it. And hopefully he'll be smart enough to see that this is the moment he's in historically. He's got to take advantage of it because Obama missed it completely.
Yeah.
And it's much more severe now.
Yeah, it's much more severe now. But this is an interesting thing, actually. The only thing that sort of caught my attention about Biden, I should be, pretty open that I sort of end up frustrating both sides in this conversation because you got to get Donald Trump out of office. I'm sorry, that's not that hard to figure out. I completely think you should, if you're in a competitive state, you should vote for Joe Biden. That's out of the way. I think clearly, there's some left momentum in some ways, but I'm sort of not. I mean, I think the conditions are there where, we're in a pandemic, over 5 million people just lost their private health insurance. Like the obvious answers of things like single payer, which were already there if you were paying attention, are getting more apparent by the day. The actual power structure, the interests that run the Democratic Party and so on, I don't see the shift. I mean, in no way undercutting the amazing work that Sanders has done. But this one thing that I found sort of interesting was I was listening to a conversation with this author, David Paul Kuhn, and he has a new book out. I think it's called The Hard Hat Rebellion. It's the day the white working class turned Republican. And it's about basically in 1970 in New York when these, hard hat guys went and beat up some Vietnam protesters.
I remember it well.
Yeah. Were you there?
I wasn't there, but I was alive and conscious. It got a lot of press coverage. Yeah.
And so this guy is definitely, I would say he's kind of I don't know if I had to place him ideologically, he's kind of he's a younger guy, but he's still sort of like a lunch pail Democrat. That's his thing. And, he doesn't support Trump, but he's definitely somebody who's going to have, certainly relative to most media, a lot more interest in the motivations of the Trump base. And there's some areas, obviously, I disagree with, but the thing that I thought was interesting was that he frames what was going on in terms of the process of class differentiation in the Democratic Party, and that basically, yes, these guys, as an example, they rioted, they were thuggish, they beat the shit out of these protesters. It was horrible. And of course, I'm not sure his position, but obviously the protesters were right about the genocide in Vietnam. But his sort of, his other sort of argument is that what wasn't being attended to here was that, basically these guys were getting shafted. They were the deindustrialization was starting. The new wave of the new left, in ways that echo today, had nothing for them other than to just sort of, condemn and blame them and, look down on them from the kind of perspective of education and social capital. And it's funny because he's probably one of the only writers in America who's very interested in Biden, because he kind of thinks that Biden is somebody who can sort of bridge to this group. And again, going to the Greenberg polling, he's showing, there are elements of the Trump base that are leaving, particularly white working class women. And so I'm curious, not to again, it's evident that a lot of the voting base of the Republican Party is doing white identitarian politics, and they responded to the vicious racism and xenophobia. And then there's this other atmospherics of, there's the economic dimension. And then there's also this feeling alienated from social power dimension, which I think is increasingly going to spill out. It's not just going to be a quote unquote white working class thing. It's going to be educated versus uneducated, and probably pretty geographically and class based. And I'm wondering, what was the good ways that Bernie approached that? And is there anything in Biden that is interesting about that? Or is it just sort of because I'm reading Kuhn and I'm just thinking to myself, Biden says he's from Scranton all the time. Who cares? So what?
Well, let me add one point to what Kuhn was arguing and talking about, because this was, historians are finally looking at the 70s really seriously. There's some great books that have come out in the last 5 years on sort of the changeover of our politics in the 70s towards the sort of neoliberal era that followed the end of the 60s. And on one hand, there was the sort of hard hat, white working class sort of anger that moved them politically to the right. At the same time, and I'd argue probably every bit as important, there was a strong movement of young workers that was to the left, especially workers coming back from Vietnam who had done time there and who'd been politicized there. So, the great story in American factories in the early 1970s was the Lordstown factory in Youngstown, Ohio, the great automobile plant, the most modern, largest in the world, where the workers did a wildcat strike. And it was a left-wing strike against working conditions. And it was, working class people, most of them vets, multiracial, and the Democratic Party had no place for them.
Right. In either direction, right? Because they're it's too radical and multiracial for some of the kind of old, but then the new stuff is just college suburban.
When we conceive of the white working class as just these sort of Archie Bunker types with hard hats, it does a great injustice to what was going on the ground there. It's a multicultural working class movement, especially coming out of the Vietnam vets. So I just wanted to toss that in there so people don't think that,
great.
I know you don't, but just people wouldn't think it's taken for granted. That's how white working class people are as a whole. I think what Bernie did was the thing that all leftists have always done by their working class candidates. You guarantee a job at a living wage. You guarantee the rights to unions. You have mass enfranchisement. You guarantee housing. Bernie built his campaign around FDR's Second Bill of Rights, which is basically the manifesto of social democracy or democratic socialism. Olof Palme, the great Swedish social democrat, probably the greatest social democrat of the 20th century, went to college in Ohio in the 1940s. And he was a conservative when he came to America. Then he saw the racism in America, and he became a radical, went back to become a socialist. But much of their social democracy is patterned after FDR's Second Bill of Rights, and that's true across Europe. And that's what Bernie's whole campaign was built on. And that basically doesn't pit people against each other. It says we all have class solidarity. We all benefit if everyone has a job, if we have housing, if we have high wages. That's the world we should build, a harmonious world. And we should eliminate the power of the wealthy to run the government and to run our lives. And if you don't do that, you have a lot of trouble. If you're just going to get into dealing with people's grievances, well, you aren't going to win that fight. The people who specialize in grievance manufacturing are going to win that. And Trump is the greatest grievance manufacturer we've ever seen.
Let's talk about your work on the internet and democracy, and specifically the origins of the internet. I mean, it gets a little bit complicated because there's this kind of hippie sort of, the internet started as this beautiful thing and it was California, and these hippies started programming and it was great. And then somehow it became bad. There was from the beginning, obviously, the military dimension of the internet. That seems to be central to the story. But that being said, I mean, in the 1990s, from reading you and others, there really was a sense that the internet could be something that was genuinely open and democratic. And now, of course, Silicon Valley is a sort of leading edge of hyper monopoly capital and, frankly, damaging our lives in so many ways.
It's funny, Michael, because, today we hold up the internet as an example of capitalism at its finest. This is the free market creating new industries, new jobs, giving us new products, better advertising, whatever you want to say. It's capitalism at the speed of light. And they usually mean that as a good thing, as a compliment. And in fact, the internet, the digital revolution, is entirely a testimony to socialism. It is a socialist creation. There was no profit in the internet for the digital communication revolution at all for decades. It was entirely bankrolled and subsidized by the federal government through the military, through the grants to research universities that really paid for this before anyone could make money on it. And this has been chronicled. We never would have had it if it hadn't been for government support. It wouldn't exist today. And that's what we did. In the 1990s, what took place was, as it suddenly became ubiquitous with the World Wide Web, and from being just something that was used by a few scientists on a handful of research university campuses in the 1980s, to something that became fairly widespread in college campuses in the early 90s, to almost overnight after the World Wide Web, within a few years, becoming ubiquitous, and certainly by the end of the decade, even before we got cable broadband and high speed. Then the question was, well, what's going to happen now? Because in the early 1990s, as it's getting ubiquitous, as people in the advertising community is freaking out, how are we going to advertise? No one's going to watch an ad on the internet. They just go to something else. You can't force people to sit through an ad. How are we going to we're going to go out of business. No one's ever going to watch an ad again. And capitalists are saying, how can we make money on this thing? Who do we charge? Where's the way to make profits? They were freaking out. As one person put it, I think it was Mark Andreessen, the founder of Netscape, the first great web browser. He said the problem with the internet is that it's militantly egalitarian and it's anti-commercial. Anything commercial was opposed. The idea that there would be a hierarchy that you'd reinforce inequality was opposed. So it was really an interesting phenomenon. It's going ubiquitous in a capitalist society, but it's structured in such a way as to make capitalism almost impossible. And what happened during the 1990s is it was restructured again to make capitalism possible. And the most important thing that happened in terms of effect was the ability to have ubiquitous surveillance of everything you do online. That was impossible, written out, made impossible in the 1990s. That was the joke about the internet. No one could know who you were when you were on it. You could have any identity you wanted. They could never find out. Well, that was taken away. That was completely stripped away, because once they could track you, then they could sell to you, and then they could package you and sell to advertisers. And then it became commercialized. So that all took place, and there was no debate over it. There wasn't like even though this was government entity, there was no public debate with, let's consider the alternatives. It was basically taken and given to these folks behind closed doors.
What's the process through which that happens? What are the major decisions that take place that allow that to happen?
Well, in the case of the internet, a lot of it takes place when you do things like protocol, which are wonky sort of things that with computer scientists and stuff, and they're not like position papers with what are the social implications. They're sort of understood, but it's done in wonky terms. And then when it gets to places where there are supposed to be discussions that take the public interest in mind, like the United States Senate or the House of Representatives, or even the Federal Communications Commission, which regulates electronic communication in the United States, even there, they adopt the position of, turning this into a capitalist industry is a really good thing. How can we help entrepreneurs, is the favorite term for monopolists, how can we help entrepreneurs fleece people better, make money building their industries here? So that became the highest priority. And pretty soon they got locked in place. So by the end of the 1990s, the only question was how exactly would they be able to make money? No one knew that. And then finally we got the big five kicked in by 2010, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, Facebook, and Google. And they set up the five monopolies. I think they are to this day the five most valuable companies in the world. And they pretty much come 0 to 60 in a decade. And they dominate completely. They are monopolists in the classic sense of the term. And they rule the roost. And unless there's political change, they will rule the roost for the rest of your lifetime.
What happens in the Obama and Trump eras around, let's just take net neutrality as the sort of entry point. But again, in terms of the specifics of how we got to a point where these companies have such a consolidation of power.
Well, net neutrality, to be clear, that refers, there's those five companies I mentioned, which basically are the dominant firms of the world controlling cyberspace, and they will control anything new that comes along because of their market power. Apple, Amazon, Facebook, Google, and Microsoft. Net neutrality doesn't refer to those five companies.
Right.
Net neutrality is how all of us access the internet on our cell phone or our computers, and that's dominated by four companies, AT&T, Comcast, Verizon, and Sprint T-Mobile. And that's most people are getting their internet access through one of those four companies. And they don't really compete with each other. They sort of divvied up the market. It's much more of a cartel than it is an oligopolistic market where there's four companies competing. And these companies are complete parasites. They're like sports team owners in professional sports. They do nothing of value for the product. They contribute nothing. What they got is they have the best lobbyists. So they get the government monopoly licenses, so no one can compete with them. You only have one cable system in the community. And once they got that, then they set up their broadband system, and it's either them or the highway. You don't have a choice. Likewise, there's only three cell phone companies you can work with, providers, because the spectrum you need, they've hogged it all up. There's no more left for anyone else. It's not like Warren Buffett can't start a new cell phone company to compete with them. There's no spectrum for him. So what these companies do is they're complete parasites, but they have monopolistic chokehold over people's access to the internet. And they can therefore charge you a lot more than you should have to pay. What we pay for a cell phone is absurd for the actual costs of what we get, or for internet access, we pay 1,000 times what it costs, probably, taking out their bogus advertising and their money for lobbyists. And the reason they do is because they have a monopoly. They have no competition. And so we should get rid of that. We pay more in the United States for internet access and cell phone than I think any other country in the world by a wide margin. And our quality is crappier because they own the politicians. They don't have to give us the same quality. Net neutrality refers to the fact that this cartel of owners, they have incentive to privatize the internet. So instead of having a neutral internet where everyone's treated equally, you're treated equally to a website from Amazon or to Google or anything else. All websites are treated equal. All services are treated equal. All customers are treated equal. It's a neutral website. If you're one of those four companies, you make your money basically by saying, hey, I'll give you pole position. You'll go faster out. If you pay us, give us a cut of your profits or pay us off. And if you won't give us any money, well, good luck. Your service won't be as good. And that's what net neutrality is all about. They want the right to basically censor the material, and they want to do it commercially to shake people down so they can force people to pay them more to get the good stuff. But they also give them political power. They can use that to say, I don't really like what you're doing. We're not going to carry you on our network. We're not going to let our people have access to you. It's way too much power for private monopolies to have. We have no justification for being in existence anyway. And so that's been a fight of activists since the mid-2000s, 2005 or 2006. Obama ran on it in 2008. He guaranteed it. And initially, those big five I talked about, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, Facebook later, they were all supporters of that. They wanted net neutrality too. They didn't want to have to get hosed by the cartel, AT&T, Verizon, those, and Comcast. But they worked out their own private deals with the cartels, so they sort of backed off. They agreed to divide up the pie between them. But Obama finally, in his second term, did institute net neutrality in 2013. And it was a very good program. It's a ton of activism got us there. And the Republicans fought it tooth and nail. Then Trump gets elected, and the first thing he does is he has the SEC abolished, go back and cancel that ruling. We've been fighting it over it ever since. Biden will give us net neutrality again if he gets in. I'm certain. I'm 99% sure. Although Comcast owns him, I think he's going to have to come through on net neutrality. But what we really need ultimately, we've got to get out of the situation where these companies have so much power. There's no justification for AT&T, Verizon, Sprint, T-Mobile, and Comcast to have this monopoly cartel ownership over internet access. It should be like the post office. Everyone should get internet access free. Like, I don't want to steal their lines. We'll pay them for their lines, whatever they paid, their actual cost. Thank you, Comcast. Here's $4 billion for all these lines we're taking from you. We'll take them off your hands so you can take the $4 billion and invest it in something else and be happy. You had a monopoly run on us for a few decades. You made a fortune. Now it's our turn to take it over. We don't need you. We'll run it like the post office. Everyone gets it for free, no secret codes to get on the line. And then you can start getting rid of all this surveillance. Once we take the profit out of it there, it gets a lot easier to make it so you're not being constantly surveilled like 1984 when you go online.
What about for the other side of it? What about when you're on? What's the policy answer to the big five there?
Well, I think each of the big five is at the point where you've got to say, should these be held privately? Should something like a Google search engine, shouldn't that just be a publicly owned municipal service like a library? Is there really anything to be gained by them having all this information on us? I don't know. I think most of these cases, if you're a monopoly and you can't be broken up effectively into smaller parts, you shouldn't be a private monopoly. It should be a public monopoly and set up so it's transparent management or operation. But you shouldn't have monopoly on something, that enormous part of our society, where you pay off all the politicians so that you never get in any trouble. But the amount of money they've got, the wealth they have, is absurd. Are we really supposed to think that Jeff Bezos is 500,000 times smarter than some capitalist who starts a business that only is worth $3 billion? No, Jeff Bezos is luckier. He's the Jed Clampett of our times. He basically hit a gusher monopoly. He found out if you have a monopoly on selling stuff online so that no one else can compete with you because you can undercut anyone to lock in the entire digital world, you can print money. Well, okay, that's a smart idea, but does he deserve to be worth $1 trillion because of that? No, that's outrageous.
What do you make of the cultural disconnect in those stories that Silicon Valley, I think less so in the last couple of years, but certainly when your book came out in 2013, Silicon Valley was still held as, not only a place of great market mythology, but even a place of corporate social responsibility. And now you see, Peter Thiel, I forget the name of it, but Peter Thiel wrote a book recently that is sort of a, business inspiration advice kind of book that basically explicitly says you're looking for a monopoly angle or maybe to get acquired by a larger monopoly. When we look at something that they themselves are putting forward as the sort of purest expression of entrepreneurship and capital, and we see that it leads to raw monopoly power, shouldn't that tell us something about some of our cultural mythology there about markets?
Yeah, I think Peter Thiel's probably sort of an embarrassment because he just tells the truth,
right?
Which is the whole idea is to have a monopoly. All this, as he points out, the whole point of capital. Look, this is something that little people aren't supposed to know. So I don't know who's watching your show, but I assume it's not a lot of billionaires. There's something if you get in the billionaire club, they all know, but you're not allowed to tell the little people. And that is the whole secret of capitalism is to become a monopolist. Go down the list of like the 30 richest people in the world, and guess what? They've all got some sort of a monopoly. Or historically, all the great fortunes are pretty much based on some sort of monopoly power, complete dominance of a market so no one can compete with you. So your risk is very low or non-existent, and you have the ability to crush competitors, move into new industries, charge them the highest prices you can charge to make the maximum profit. That's the secret. And, we're supposed to tell, it's based on competition and free enterprise. That's just stuff they tell us to shut us up and get us to blame ourselves for being losers. While they rake in all the money and their kids and grandkids will be raking it in and lecturing us the next generation. So that's Peter Thiel just told the truth and said, let's stop apologizing and trying to hide it. Just say that's the way it should be. You guys who aren't monopolists are losers. We're the good people. We deserve to be rich. And this society works better with us running it and you guys doing what you're told.
Do you think that there's something specific about Amazon, both in terms of the just unprecedented wealth personally of Jeff Bezos? I don't mean specific in terms of its all five of them are a major problem, but I mean as an opening politically right now. There's also been a lot of, we interviewed Chris Smalls, who did some incredible organizing at great personal cost and was targeted in a vicious and racist way by Amazon leadership. But there's this opportunity. I mean, on one hand, we talk about the unprecedented power of Amazon across a range. I mean, because they're not only surveilling us, they've also got these frictionless supply chains, which have these horrifying totalitarian implications for labor. But then on the flip side, and Dustin Guastalla, who's a labor organizer, pointed this out to us, like, well, yeah, that's totally true. And it's very dangerous and damaging. But also, they've got, unlike, say, Google, they've got thousands of people in factories in the United States and Europe, as an example, that could coordinate, that could, and a growing public attention, maybe even just around something as kind of tabloid as that $1 trillion mark. I mean, that is a new, we've culturally gotten used to the ideas of billionaires, which we shouldn't, but trillion that's like a whole other ask of people.
I think that's going to be one of the big issues of the next decade. It's got to become one. I mean, I think that in communication, there are three great issues that are going to be at the center of politics. One is dealing with that cartel and control over access to the internet. We got to get rid of them, make it like the post office. The second is dealing with these big five monopolies. I think we have to deal with them, probably get rid of them and nationalize certain aspects of what they do. But there's not a simple solution, but that amount of economic power and wealth is unacceptable any way you slice it. It's got to be dealt with. It's too much. And now they're, like you said, the old days of the CEO playing hacky sack with his multicultural workers in the parking lot at lunchtime, those glory days. That's, now we're the Peter Thiels of the world who have big contracts with the Pentagon, who are like the richest people in the world, who buy and sell politicians like you probably did baseball cards 25 years ago. That's the reality of these people. And the next generation's they're capitalists. Capitalism trumps hippie at that level. So we're going to have to deal with them. And then the third area is one we haven't talked about, which is the complete collapse of journalism as a commercially viable institution, not just in the United States, but it's a global phenomenon. The commercial system of journalism is dead. And we have very few working journalists today per capita in the United States compared to a generation ago. And what few remain are all on death watch right now because of the economy. And we're testing a theory. Can you actually have a functional society if people have no means of information to know what's going on? We're testing that theory. They're going to rely on Twitter and tweets from people to tell them how they should feel. By the way, I framed that rhetorical question. You know my answer. And one of the nice things about American history and about democratic theory is that you don't have to be an expert to understand really early on. Everyone who's ever dealt seriously with how to have a self-governing society has made having an independent, functional, credible information system, journalism, as mandatory. It wasn't like, hey, maybe we'll luck out and get one. No, it's like, if you don't have that, nothing else can work. That's the oxygen of a free society, of a functional society. And we really don't have that oxygen now. We just have farts in the air for the most part, but very little oxygen.
What's the strategy for that?
Well, I think the problem with journalism is why the commercial model is failed. Journalism is a public good. It's something society desperately needs, but the market doesn't generate in sufficient quality or quantity. And the framers understood that. In the 19th century, we had enormous subsidies to give us an independent free press, postal subsidies. Almost all newspapers were distributed through the mails, and they basically were distributed for free. So they took the entire cost of distribution out of newspaper publishing, which meant we had many more newspapers per capita than any other country in the world. And it was the foundation of our politics. That's how you did political work, was newspapers. If you went into a major city in 1870, there were 15 or 20 daily newspapers, different languages. I mean, you were just rife in this culture of information. And what happened was that those subsidies began to disappear when you could start making money publishing. And big time money came with the rise of modern capitalism and advertising. And advertising gave the illusion that journalism could be really profitable. These vast fortunes, Scripps, Pulitzer, Hearst became billionaires or 100 millionaires with these monopoly newspapers all over the country. But then when the internet came along, all that advertising left newspapers. And it became clear that actually that was a fluke, that advertisers had to support journalism for a century to satisfy their commercial needs. But now in the internet era, they no longer need to. And so they pulled their support from newspapers and from all journalism. And all journalism is withered on the vine as a result, because it's a public good. It needs public support. Postal subsidies won't work now. But the trick with journalism policies, you have to have enough money to have well-paid, independent, credible, competing newsrooms. But the money's got to come from the public sector, but the government can't control the money. You can't allow Donald Trump to say, you get the money, or right. Anyone. Bernie Sanders shouldn't say, you get the money. It should be, so you need public money.
You get the money. Sorry.
Yeah, you need public money without government control. Mm-hmm. And so that's the trick policy we have solved. And the best solution I've seen, and the one I advocate, was first developed by a wonderful economist named Dean Baker, who you've probably seen Dean's stuff. Yeah. He writes on a variety of issues. And he anticipated this before anyone else. He said, basically, we need to give every American a voucher of government money they can spend in any nonprofit medium of their choice. So what I would propose is that we give every American over the age of 18 $200 of government money they can allocate to any nonprofit, non-commercial news medium of their choice, as long as it meets a few simple IRS codes and other things to prevent fraud. And imagine, and I think it's going to catch on. It's now, because especially with what's happened with the Black Lives Matters protests that have been going on, because one of the crises in the African American community in rural America is what we call a news desert, something that didn't really exist 50 years ago. Now the whole country's a news desert. That's an area that has no functional reporting covering the local politics. None.
Right.
There literally are huge chunks of America where there is no journalism whatsoever. Not even one person really covering the area. Neighborhoods, communities, inner suburbs and cities, no one's covering them. And so what this would do, if everyone had, say, $200, everyone over 18, $200, they could allocate to any nonprofit medium, it would mean, let's say you live in New York, take it. What about in Brooklyn? Let's say there was a Bedford-Stuyvesant. How many people live in Bed-Stuy? 100,000, 200,000?
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah. Let's say they all pooled their money. Well, that's like $20 million or of that you could put together. You could build a really nice newsroom for $10 million that just covered Brooklyn and Bed-Stuy. And then, it'd be very competitive, because if they screwed up and didn't do a good job, the next year people would give their grant to someone else. But it would be controlled by individuals. They wouldn't have to give if they want. They picked who got the money. The government had no control over that. So that's the direction.
It would be like a government-backed commons for journalism.
It would be government subsidy, but people control who gets the money and how it's used. And if they determine if they like it or don't like it, it's not, the government has no control over that, just using neutral criteria, which already exist by the Internal Revenue Service for who would qualify. They have actually a pretty advanced system there for donors and all to deal with.
The follow-up question, and the last thing I would really like to hear your thoughts on it. It's one of the things that's interesting in the journalism conversation right now, and I think also reflects Bernie and Trump and all of these conversations, is what I call the pre and post critique. And especially like in 2016, occasionally Trump would say these things that were true, and they were surprising to hear from somebody who could be president, but the upshot was very different. So let me make a actual example. One time he was on Fox News, I think with Bill O'Reilly, and they were talking about Russia. And he said, what, you don't think the United States, you don't think we kill people?
I remember it well.
Yeah. And it was cathartic. It was funny, and it was true. And of course, unlike you, let's say, or Bernie for that matter, who might be willing to say that, the follow-up would be, and that's wrong, and we're going to attempt to change our foreign policy. Trump was, we all do it. Let's stop bullshitting. Let's say what it is, which I think the appeal of that is, particularly before the guys actually governed, makes a lot of sense. And when we look at the implosion of media, and we look at just how bad so much of it is, like look at how they cover foreign policy, look at how they, just so bad. I sound like Trump now. And you think, what is the way that the kind of pre and post critique of things gets confused, right? Like the New York Times is awful in many, many ways and is the point. So therefore I want everything to be a personally tailored Fox News program, or is the point that I actually want a genuinely actual, open, and truly universally representative media? And I think so many conversations now kind of conflate critiques, basically, that both have some things that are true, but they point in very different directions. But in both cases, they kind of point to that loss of the center or the collapse of these institutions that have really undermined their own credibility and have, you know, let these conversations occur. And then these institutions themselves don't necessarily make the distinction. You know, that was a big thing during the campaign. Oh, Bernie's criticizing media monopolies. He's criticizing Jeff Bezos's power. That sounds like Trump.
Yeah. Well, that's a whole show there.
Yes.
And more. It gets right to the heart of some of the decay in our society today that didn't exist in the same way a generation ago. And, you look at, here's an example. In 2016, I live in Wisconsin. Trump spent a lot of money advertising in Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. When they realized they had a chance to win here, they funneled a lot of ads here in the last 2 or 3 weeks of the campaign for Election Day. Hillary was doing nothing here. She was convinced she was going to win. She's planning her award speech or victory speech or something. Didn't campaign here at all. Well, on TV, if you were to watch a Trump ad in those last few weeks, with the exception of a relatively brief segment of it that would be about immigrants, the rest of it was a Bernie ad. It was about corruption, money and politics, politicians who don't care about you, crazy wars that make no sense. It was a Bernie ad. That's what he ran on. And he didn't run on, let's balance the budget, cut Social Security, get rid of public education. None of that stuff. He ran a Bernie ad, except for the immigration stuff. That was just one nod.
Right.
And the point is that right-wing populist movements are not traditional conservatives. They are, in their pure form, fascist. They have a very strong populist element to them, and people they appeal to have a lot of anger at those above them as much as those below them. The problem, among others, of all these fascist movements is invariably when they get in power, they become tools of those above them. That's always BS, always, without exception, BS. And that's true with Trump and Bolsonaro and Hitler, Mussolini, all of them fit into that. But I mean, that's sort of, so yeah, you're watching that Trump ad in October of 2016, and you're watching Hillary's ad, which is whatever she's doing. And you're going, well, this guy, Trump's talking about the world I'm living in, at least. Right. She's talking about the world she's living in and her funders live in. It has nothing to do with me. And it's just the usual political BS I've heard for the last 40 years. And you can see why he would have appeal to people who are frustrated, who aren't fascist, but who are frustrated.
Yeah, and how that really important sort of that those things get conflated in terms of critique. I guess the final question I have for you is, what is the best way to relate to, is there a way to relate to a Biden presidency that isn't either this sort of, I think, frankly, kind of magical sort of like, oh, well, you just got to keep going and push them to the left. Or on the other hand, just saying like, all right, whatever, Comcast Joe, MBNA Joe is president. Is there a way of relating to him and that presidency that is, constructive while being really grounded in reality about the power dynamics?
That's a great question, and a very important one. I'm glad you're asking. I think it's exactly the question progressives need to be asking themselves. And I don't think there's an immediate answer, too. We've got to be discussing it like we're doing here, thinking about how to do it. I start from the premise, like you, that getting rid of Trump is absolutely the single most important thing facing humanity in November. And whoever was running against him, I feel that way. If it was Bernie, it'd be a whole different thing. But even Biden, Trump,
that would be the big good versus evil race right there.
But Trump has to go. There's nothing, no ifs, ands, or buts. That's the single most important. The second thing we have to do is get rid of Mitch McConnell controlling the U.S. Senate. And they're very close to each other. And I know in both cases, what replaces that will not be what I would like. It will not be Bernie Sanders and Jeff Merkley and AOC sort of setting the policy. But I do know it will stop stuff that we will not be able to get back in the tube later from happening, and that our very survival hangs on it, in my opinion. So, but I think I don't think there's a simple way to approach it. I think it's going to be a combination of both possibilities that you suggest is I think we have to, for one thing, I don't think we should just say, hey, let's get in bed with Joe and push his agenda. I think we have to take it to him and push him as hard as we can on every possible issue. And, I don't think you necessarily break with him in the sense of destroying his presidency, but I don't think you give him an easy pass. And I think you sometimes have to really call him out on a really important issue. I think it's imperative to demonstrate and bring people out to let this guy see that, look, don't get big for your britches. We got you elected. We expect results, and what you was doing in the past won't work. So am I hopeful that will work with him? Well, I'm hopeful he'll be smart enough to see that he's got to adjust to have a successful presidency. And whether the system will allow him that, his bankrollers, his funders, his corporate donors who've been paying him for however long, they're not going to be happy with that, because almost every important issue is go right up against that, his funders. And so it's going to take a vision, courage, political talent that I don't know if Joe Biden has. So I haven't seen it yet. We'll see. Obama didn't have it, but Obama didn't. This is, but at any rate, but I do think in the near term, we are, and then ironically, Michael, I think in this great period where everything's lined up for a period of dramatically progressive social change in this country. We are the majority. We really are. I mean, you wouldn't know it watching MSNBC, where you think Claire McCaskill's leading the revolution, or CNN or any of these other places. But we are the majority, and we're growing every day. And we've got really humane, sensible policies that will solve problems and give us a planet we can live on together and have good lives. And they're popular where they've been done in other countries, and they'll be loved here. And the examples we've tried it with Social Security and Medicare, they were hugely successful. Public education, when it's funded well, hugely successful. So we'll stick with the fight, but it's really hard to predict right now. Because let's put it this way: 5 years ago, if I said to you, January 2015, said, "Hey, what's going to happen in the next 5 years?" If I told you, one of us said, "Well, this is what's probably going to happen," so you said it's impossible. I don't believe that. You must be kidding. What a joke. That could never happen. One thing I like to think about to close is I'm an optimist by nature, and the reason for my optimism is that things do change and we can't ever predict them. And we can just sort of try to get a historical sense of where we're at. And I think we're at a good point in some ways historically in terms of where people are at. Much more progressive country today than 30 years ago. Not even close. I mean, it's night and day difference. Now, if a majority of the people vote, progressives are going to win. It's just getting people out to vote is our struggle. That wasn't the case 30 years ago. But I had a professor in graduate school at the University of Washington in Seattle. He was from South Africa, a white South African. But he was anti-apartheid. That's why he came to America. And his family was all back in South Africa. And they were all working in the ANC with Mandela against apartheid. And before I moved to Madison in 1988, I went into his office to say goodbye. And he was very sad. And I said, "What's wrong, Tony? Why are you, what's the problem?" Because he normally wasn't that sad. And he said, "Well, I've just been talking to my comrades in South Africa, and they say the situation is now hopeless. The ruling party will never give up apartheid. Mandela will never be released from prison. We all are convinced it's going to now come down to pure violence, and it's going to be a bloodbath. And the country, however it is up, will not be suitable to live in. There's so much death and destruction is going to take place. It's just they're irretractable. They refuse to negotiate under any circumstances if it means giving up white supremacy and white control of society." That was in June of 1988.
Wow.
And I talked to friends of mine who were South African activists that later, they said that time, that's how they all thought. It was hopeless. Never been worse. 2 years later, Nelson Mandela was released from Robben Island prison, where he'd been for 30 years. 2 or 3 years after that, he's elected in a landslide the president of South Africa. In that intervening 5 years, there was less violence than you'd see in a New Jersey bar fight on a Saturday night. I mean, it was a completely nonviolent revolution that went from 1988 to 1990, 1993. And no one saw that coming in 1988. The smartest people who devoted their lives to that issue were completely unprepared for that, right on the verge of it's happening. So we have, we can never tie ourselves down by saying, well, it doesn't look that good now, man. That's ridiculous. Think it looked good in South Africa? Look what happened there.
Well, and even the violence that did emerge in that time, whether it was there was the third force, white nationalist violence, there was also some violence between ANC and I'm forgetting the Zulu Nationalist Party, but Mandela got a grip on those, and the ANC. So even when those things did pop up, as you were saying, I mean, the power structure changed so quickly, and that is, I've read about that time, and it is amazing to read because there's this enormous acceleration of violence going on from the security services and in rhetoric. And that's also the same time where, like the head of intelligence, Neil Bernard, is basically like, yeah, we're negotiating an endgame here. And the real question is what the settlement is. And all of those negotiations are taking place. And, people obviously like the professor couldn't have known. So yeah, that's such a great way to leave it. Yeah.
For us today, that means going forward, we may well be in May of 1988 for all we know. We won't know for a while, but you look at the sort of where things are, the issues that are going on, the demonstration you've seen, the crises we're facing, and the mindset of people and the culture. And it is highly combustible. Very good things could happen. And similarly, some pretty bad things could happen. And that's exactly why Trump cannot be reelected in November.
I agree. Well, Professor Robert McChesney, I really appreciate your time. Bob, thanks a million. I hope you'll join us again. Really appreciate all your time and, of course, all your work.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thanks. Be well.
You too.
All right, folks. I love learning from these folks.
Yeah.
Let's see. I have to step off for a second, but David, do you want to get the gem started?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, just give me get started, but I'll be right back.
Yeah, I'll go. So I wanted to tell everybody about something that I've been watching. One thing, just in general, if you've been watching the gems over this period of time, or just really paying attention to politics, one of the biggest things that you need to dissuade yourself of from kind of like typical political analysis is this idea that the stock market is like an index of the real economy. Obviously, that's 101. That's the beginning of starting to think like socialists and understanding that is a profit system for a very specific group of people in the society. And I bring that up because there's a lot of people who are feeling very on their own level. They're struggling very much, obviously, with this coronavirus crisis. And then you see, you go on CNN or you turn on MSNBC or any of these major cable news channels, and you see, a rebound in the stock market, and it can be very confusing to folks. It's really important for people to understand, that is not a reflection of the real economy. In fact, that kind of exuberance usually is an example of something bad to come in the near future. And I bring that up because I wanted to point people to start, to think about, what they should be watching, and specifically, you should be watching what the banks are doing. Not because the banks always get it right. They certainly have the same kind of tendencies and are just as exploitative as people on the stock market. But they oftentimes have at least a longer term goal than just people who are participating in short transactions on the stock market. I bring this up because one of the big stories over the past few days has been that the three largest banks in the United States, Wells Fargo, JP Morgan Chase, and Citigroup, have set aside $28 billion to cover future losses. Now, that's really what you should be watching, because that is a completely different index and barometer for how a class of analysts who basically are watching like the general economy are reacting to the shifts that have been happening. And just before I get into the larger analysis, like here's a quote from Jennifer Pipsack, JP Morgan's chief financial officer. We'll expect to gain more visibility on the damage that we're dealing with over the coming months. JP Morgan is predicting that the unemployment rate is going to remain in double digits for the rest of the year. Wells Fargo as well has an unemployment forecast in the same area. And just so people understand too, this does not mean that these banks are not profiting immensely from the situation. In fact, JP Morgan is receiving record revenue. But what they're doing with that is they're actually stockpiling away because they expect that the loans they've given out, especially over the past few months, are going to go bad in the near future. And on top of it, it's not just American banks, obviously, and European banks is a whole other conversation, honestly, with how they participate. But they failed stress tests from the Federal Reserves that showed that they are very exposed and are very likely to, face pretty severe consequences from being exposed as people are unable to pay their loans in the next few weeks and months, and today. So the people who are trying to take a little bit of a longer term in the economy, who have every benefit in the society, including a Federal Reserve, which is being very, very proactive in protecting them. So I'm not even saying what they're doing is adequate. What I'm saying to you is that like those people are looking at what's going on in the United States economy, and they're saying this does not look very promising for the near future. I'm not saying that it won't be promising for their own personal bank accounts, but they think that there's going to be more pain to come. And it's obvious that we're in this kind of crisis. For 14 weeks, over 1 million people have been 14 weeks, over 1 million people have been filing for first-time jobless benefits, unemployment benefits. That's ridiculous. I mean, that's pandemic, that's Great Depression level numbers. And it's only becoming, it only gets missed by most of us because this time is so exceptional for all of us. Yes, there have been some modest recoveries, and that's why you see the stock market becoming so exuberant over the past few weeks and months, is because, yes, you have seen some people go back to work. But look, we are still in a situation where the payroll employment rate is 14.7 million less than it was just in February. I mean, if you think that we've come anywhere close to out of this crisis, you're wrong. And obviously, the big fight that we're facing right now is maintaining the small amount of benefits that people got in the first place that allowed there to be that allowed an even worse catastrophe from happening. If the Republicans hold out and try to prevent unemployment benefits let those expire, it's going to get way worse. Literally, the unemployment benefits have been pumping in around $18 billion a week into an economy that for the most part is shut down. Without those kind of benefits, things would be so much worse right now. And obviously, the economic arguments that the GOP is making that this disincentivizes work are completely bogus. In fact, these unemployment benefits are probably the only reason that there has been any job gains or that there's any work going on across the board, because if people weren't able to afford food, services, and rent at all, then, we wouldn't have any kind of economic activity. Last week we talked about the crisis when it comes to people being unable to pay their rent. It looks like people are now defaulting on the mortgage payments. Amazon, Kroger, Stop and Shop are now ending their hero pay. And last thing, just to note on the people who are coming back to work, most of those people are just people who are being, rehired from jobs that they were laid off from 2 months ago, right? So that's not even a proper job growth. And, kind of more anecdotal evidence is showing that we're seeing a decline in job postings on, the major internet job boards and things of that nature. So the fact is that not only is our government failing us, but the kind of meager aid that they gave out in the first place is the only thing that is sort of keeping this engine going. And, we need to be very adamant and pushing, your representatives, Democrats, all these people to make sure that they literally do, the bare minimum to prevent this whole thing from collapsing. But what we're seeing, the indicators that we're seeing from people in power and, the banks and things like that, they don't think that this is going to be the case, that this kind of ridiculous fantasy that, this kind of right wing is living in, and also the Democrats. I mean, I'm sorry, this is a moment that it should be a lot clearer to people how big of a failure, Congress across the board has been at responding to this crisis when you compare it to any other country in our kind of economic situation, or even to just compare it to what the Federal Reserve has done versus what Congress has done. Because if they're not able to get these kind of basic protections in and reinstate them, it's going to get a lot worse, and it's going to get a lot worse very quickly.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You nailed it. And this is a good flow out. Everybody, if you haven't yet watched the piece David did last week on the eviction crisis and strategies around saving people's homes and the housing crisis generally. But yeah, I mean, I think that you'll see this is going to be probably another move if Trump, whatever the hell is going on with him, the Republicans will come back to the table with some new meager concessions to getting people checks. It's a necessity for anybody of any party that's running for re-election. But what we've seen so far is nothing real. There isn't a Paycheck Protection Act. There's nothing serious on evictions and home foreclosures. And, these bills, like most infamously the CARE Act, over 90% of it is just a complete federal consolidation and redistribution of money for monopoly capital in the United States. Mm-hmm. So even though there's I wouldn't even say there's optimism. There is a necessity that there will be some response. There will be some sugar put into the system because nobody's going to go to the ballot box with, voting down tens of millions of people getting some, I don't even know what to say, absolute bare minimum relief, even though these checks are completely insufficient. They should be, at a bare minimum $2,000 a month for every American, along with, of course, implementation of measures on healthcare and housing immediately. But that being said, if they do it, watch out for even more just corporate grand theft of the country. And what they have been doing, which is, completely non-structural. It's Band-Aids for humans and basically just like the next level of consolidation for an incredibly small amount of oligarchic power in the society.
And I just wanted to add specifically, yes, I do think that when it does hit, it's a game of chicken, obviously. And yes, there very likely will be some form of concessions just because it just looks like it has to happen. But what it looks like the GOP is really fixating on trying to do is trying to make sure that employers have no legal liability to take care of people, which is so horrible in any kind of circumstance, but especially now, especially when the beginning of this fight, the labor fight at least, was about, yes, making sure that people are getting extra wages and aren't, losing their jobs and things of that nature, but also making sure that bare minimum, cuts to production, for example, talking about Tyson Chicken and all these other corporations that are continuing to not only exploit their employees, but putting them at severe risk of, Tyson and all of these meat packing facilities became super spreaders in their region. Because these corporations were completely unwilling to do the basic kind of safety procedures necessary. And the Republicans are basically hoping that they, thinking that they're going to be able to squeeze that out of the Democrats, by basically holding the rest of the economy hostage. Saying we won't give you the benefits unless you, make a law that prevents, any lawsuits against an employer for not obeying basic safety standards, which is ridiculous. So, it's multifaceted too. And we have to be adamant. And it's difficult to do right now, obviously, because of the quarantine and where we are. But this is a very serious life or death situation for so many people. We can't let people fall through the wayside right now more than ever.
There's no question about that. You know what, guys, I want to do this Brazil story up top before we go to the post game. So just check the outline. Take about 10 minutes on this. And Artesia's running a bit behind. So I'm not feeling the best, but I'll try to power through a little bit here. So I want to just do this because it's, obviously just continuing the loop on this story. The coverage of Lula and the broader implications for Latin America and U.S. policy have been so important for us. This is a new piece, of course, in Brazil Wire. Our partners on the interview with President Lula, go watch it. And, of course, just indispensable coverage of Brazil in general. How the FBI toppled presidents in Brazil I'm going to quote a little bit. Natalie Viana, editor from the respected Brazilian investigative journalism site Agência Pública, recently published a 5-part series based on information shared from Telegram conversations revealed by Intercept Brazil as part of the Vaza Jato scandal. In the series, she shows how Lava Jato Task Force Director, Public Prosecutor Delton Dallagnol received financial compensation through an asset sharing scheme based on kickbacks from fines that the U.S. government collected from Brazilian companies and individuals. According to Vienna, during the meeting in which they negotiated the asset sharing deal, Delton received a cash payment in a leaked message. Dallagnol says, yesterday we spoke with them about asset sharings of fines associated with actions against Petrobras, and there's a positive perspective on some of these value asset sharing in elegant terms for division of cash. So this is really important, and this comes on a set of also revealing deeper connections between the FBI and the Lava Jato task force, and specifically, like literally, we've talked about this before, but it's gotten further reported, the actual personal financial incentives of the political prosecutors of Lula, and basically their own, not only their own careers and political goals, but actually financial interests. Now, and don't forget, I mean, as Lula said to Judge Moro, when are we going to talk about this politicized operation and all the jobs it's lost? I mean, this Petrobras is a major company. It's a state oil company, which, again, whatever other issues, the Workers' Party made sure revenue from it was going into vital social needs like education and healthcare, and it provided a lot of jobs. So this just sort of adds to it. And there's also this additional revelation that the FBI's International Corruption Unit said that the FBI started, quote, looking for countries that could invite FBI agents into analyzing corruption investigations that have connections to the United States in 2014. Just as President Lula said, I don't have proof yet, but I have strong suspicions about a U.S. role. I want to play this clip now. This is Brian Mayer on Telesur talking again about the broader political context of lawfare. This is a prime tool of U.S. foreign policy, opposing progressive governance in Latin America, and this has huge implications.
Yesterday would have marked 8 months since the coup against the Bolivian people and their president of the plurinational state of Bolivia, Evo Morales. It's worth recalling that it was under the pretext of corruption and through systematic lawfare that in April 2016, Dilma Rousseff, president of Brazil, was ousted in a coup, and in similar fashion, they conspired against Lula to prevent him from being democratically elected into the presidency. So how is it that corruption has served to take out the leaders of the left, but Bolsonaro's people have remained, relatively speaking, unscathed?
Well, it's obvious, Camila, that these corruption charges are weaponized and politicized. This U.S.-backed operation, Lava Jato, was used even as a kind of Trojan horse to go after other left Latin American leaders in other countries through this corruption case involving Odebrecht Construction Company, which is worth remembering is one of the biggest competitors of the American companies Halliburton and Bechtel, which get all of these contracts in Africa and in other countries in Latin America. So in a way, by going after Odebrecht, the U.S. government was helping take out competition for its own engineering companies. So we see that anti-corruption is just a kind of facade. It's a technique to go after enemies, and that's what lawfare is. It's using the law to annihilate a political enemy. And in this case, corruption has become the rallying cry for these U.S.-backed lawfare attacks against left leaders all over Latin America. You see the latest thing with Evo Morales. Now they're trying to say he's a terrorist or something. They went after Michelle Bachelet in Chile, Cristina Kirchner, leaders all over Latin America with this.
And so this is very important. Now, again, it doesn't mean that there may or may not be individual cases of corruption, but the structural issue here of U.S. deployment of corruption as a foreign policy tool, which you can also correlate with the use of corruption rhetoric from right-wing authoritarians, Donald Trump, Narendra Modi. There was a huge anti-corruption campaign in India, looking actually in the early years of how Putin consolidated power. Now, there was objective performance in some of these cases, but there's also a lot of rhetoric. And in Lula's case, kind of most infamously, the complete co-optation, the way that the press ran with this is very, very important for people to understand and see how these things operate, both in terms of lawfare and in terms of, again, complicating the conversation on corruption itself. This is just, again, there's just so much goddamn moralism. There's the quote unquote corruption of somebody governing a country and making deals in the system as it is to deliver for people cannot be properly understood as quote unquote corruption. That's not you're taking money from the UNICEF fund for vaccines and redirecting it into a Swiss bank account. And in fact, if we look at it more broadly, we can actually look at the literal global economic system is designed to do that function. There is, I was watching a documentary called The Wonderful World of Tony Blair about his just totally awesome post-prime ministerial lifestyle. And, tens of millions of dollars, contracts in Kuwait and Kazakhstan, and double dipping when he was a peace envoy with cell phone and natural gas deals that implicate JP Morgan, who he was advising. And you know what? I'm quite sure that all of that stuff is to the letter, to the T, legal. So we need to get into an actual conversation, as always, that looks at the full range of things, isn't buried in kind of, dogmatic thinking, and also understands the power dynamics at play. Because this deployment in Latin America has rolled back the pink tide and caused an enormous amount of damage, which we're seeing daily with, as an example, what Bolsonaro has done with Corona, among infinitely other, many, many other things. All right, guys, become a patron, patreon.com/TMBS. It's how this thing happens. We're very proud of what we do, and we appreciate all the support. Next week's guest just slipped my mind. That's embarrassing. Kimberly, you know what? I have to look it up. I will talk about next week's guests in the post game. This Sunday, in-depth conversation with Susan Green, patreon.com/TMBS. We'll be back in a little bit. Artesia Balthrop, and we're going to cover some stories in the post game. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, David. Take care, everybody.